I'm Ramlin Reck, and you're watching Appleseed Academy. On April 19, 1775, in the pre-dawn hours, John Parker stood on Lexington Green. He was not a well man. He had what we know today as tuberculosis, which the colonists called consumption. In fact, within 5 months of that day, he would be dead. Parker was 46 years old and a father of 6. He was also a descendant of the courageous settlers who had risked everything to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony over 150 years before. About 4 hours earlier, just after midnight, an alert rider had knocked on Parker's door. The alert rider came to tell him not that the British are coming, as you may have learned in school, but that the regulars are coming out. Everyone in the colonies was a British citizen. Telling Parker that the British were coming would have made no sense to him. What the alert rider actually told John Parker was that the regulars were coming out. Parker knew what that meant. For the 4th time in less than a year, his own government was sending the army in an attempt to disarm the colonists. Parker's neighbors and fellow militiamen would probably not have blamed him if he'd stayed home because they knew how sick he was. But he couldn't say no. You see, Parker wasn't just a citizen or another militiaman. He was Captain John Parker, an experienced soldier elected by his men to lead them. He was a veteran of the British Army who had seen battle at the Siege of Quebec and on the Plains of Abraham during the French and Indian War. The flame of liberty burned brightly in his heart. After the alert rider left to spread the word, Captain Parker called for his men to assemble on the green. Once assembled, Parker and his 70-some men stood in parade formation on the green. A third of the men were related to him through blood or marriage. As British citizens, these men had all the rights of Englishmen, including the right to bear arms. When the British government decided to tighten their control over the colonies, the citizens strenuously objected. The British government had responded with force and threats and military action. And now agents of Parker's own government, the Redcoats, were coming to disarm them. Having served in the British Army 10 years before, he had proudly worn the same bright red coat of the approaching regulars. He must have been dismayed at the situation, asking himself, how had it come to this? As Parker watched the regulars approach, he knew that he and his men were about to commit an act of treason by resisting the king's troops, which was punishable by hanging. How had it come to this? Over 150 years before, settlers came to the New World seeking liberty. During that time, they had learned to govern themselves. They became accustomed to that, and the Crown had unwisely left them to their own devices in a policy of salutary neglect. These colonists grew fiercely independent. Following the French and Indian War, the British treasury was depleted. They looked to their colonies in America as a source of revenue in a way not used anywhere else in the British Empire. This offended and chafed the liberty-loving colonists. To force the colonists into submission, the king and parliament passed a series of oppressive laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Finally, in response to the growing lawlessness, the king ordered a military takeover of Boston. Boston Harbor, a major trade port, was blockaded by the British Navy. General Thomas Gage had been appointed military governor of Massachusetts in 1774 after the local governments elected by the colonists had been dissolved by the order of Parliament to be replaced by magistrates appointed by the governor. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was full of tension and anticipation of the conflict many colonists knew was inevitable. On one side were the Tories, British citizens loyal to the king. They believed in submission to the royal authority without any reservation. On the other side were the Whigs, colonists who favored self-government based on consent of the governed, which they had enjoyed for over 100 years without a great deal of interference from the British government, until now. General Gage received orders from the king and Parliament. His orders were to regain control of these rebellious subjects, or he would be replaced by someone who could. This would have ended his career. He was also ordered to not use deadly force. He decided on a plan that tyrants throughout history had used to control rebellious subjects. He would disarm them. Gage decided to disarm the colonists and capture the ringleaders of the Sons of Liberty, or the seditious rebels as they were called in England. General Gage wished to avoid war if possible. There was no gunpowder made in North America and very few arms, so this strategy seemed like it should be effective. General Gage first seized the Colonial powder supply at Cambridge in September 1774. This caught the colonists completely off guard. Although the first powder raid was highly successful, the colonists took steps so that it could never be repeated. Successive so-called powder alarms didn't actually seize much powder because most of New England towns had already hidden their supplies. However, these powder raids spurred the colonists to develop a very active intelligence network. The colonists also developed a very effective and widespread alarm system. Gage's next two attempts to seize arms and ammunition were completely foiled in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in December 1774 and Salem, Massachusetts in February 1775. The colonists were becoming stronger in their defiance and more effective as time went on, and the military government was becoming weaker. This set the stage for April 1775. General Gage learned of a large supply of powder and munitions stockpiled in Concord and decided to seize the arms. He devised a plan in secret, or so he thought. The colonists got wind of Gage's plans by noting a flurry of military activity both in Boston Harbor and among the city's troops. They sent Paul Revere, a member of the Sons of Liberty, to warn Concord on April 8th. The townspeople removed most of the material away from town and buried the rest in recently plowed fields. On April 18th, Revere learned that General Gage planned to march his regulars out that night to seize arms in Concord. Gage also planned to arrest two of the Patriot ringleaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who had fled Boston and were staying in Lexington. How Revere learned of the plan isn't known, but historians speculate that information was supplied by General Gage's wife, Mrs. Margaret Gage. Margaret Gage was a colonist born in New Jersey. She had strong Whig sympathies. She probably communicated the information to Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the few Whig leaders who had not fled Boston by then. She and Dr. Warren were very close friends, and Warren was a member of the Sons of Liberty. The problem the Sons of Liberty faced was getting the message out of Boston, as General Gage had anticipated colonists sending an alarm as they had on the two previous raids. On the night of April 18th, he ordered the guard at Boston Neck to close the road. Boston Neck, you see, was the only land route out of Boston. He also ordered the Navy to seal the harbor. Lastly, he sent a 20-member patrol out during the day to fan out on the roads and intercept any alert riders. To counter these actions, Paul Revere and his friends devised a threefold plan. William Dawes, a merchant whose business frequently took him out through Boston Neck Road, was sent out by that route. He was familiar with the Boston Guard and was able to make his way through. At about 10 p.m., Paul Revere rowed across Boston Harbor with the help of two friends in a boat he had previously hidden. Other colonists climbed into the steeple at the Old North Church and sent a lantern signal across to Charlestown. The lantern signal was to be 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. That night, watchers on the shore in Charlestown saw 2 lights in the church tower, indicating the regulars were going to be coming across the bay instead of marching out across Boston Neck. When Revere reached the shore in Charlestown, there was a strong, fast horse waiting for him, and he set out to spread the alarm. While waiting for Revere, the Charlestown group had seen the signal lights from the North Church and had sent out their own express rider. This rider was intercepted and never reached his destination. However, other messengers rode out to spread the word, including Solomon Brown and Josiah Nelson, and another unnamed messenger sent out by Dr. Warren earlier that day. Paul Revere eluded the British patrols and took a northern route to Lexington. He stopped at every hamlet to alert people on events of news that the regulars were coming out. These people in turn began to send out their own messengers and to assemble the militia. Something to consider. The value a society places on freedom and liberty can be measured by how many people show up to defend it when it's threatened. By the end of the day on April 19, 1775, over 14,000 patriots had taken up arms from Boston and surrounding areas. Could you muster 14,000 armed patriots today to help defend liberty? Could you get 1,000 to answer the call? How about 100, even in this day of instant communication of Twitter and Facebook? Revere arrived in Lexington around midnight and warned Adams and Hancock. He also stopped by the home of Captain Parker of the Lexington militia to alert him. He in turn sent out the word for his men to assemble on the green at once. Meanwhile, on the night of April 18th, between 800 and 900 British regulars were quietly being roused from their beds. They were sent in small groups to quietly to avoid suspicion to assemble on Boston's Back Bay. The Navy was waiting in longboats to transport them across the bay to Charlestown. General Gage had followed a practice that was time-honored in the British Army to assemble a strike force of his very best troops from among his various regiments. These troops were the 11 Grenadier Companies, men chosen for their strength and size and often used to smash through a strong defensive line. There were also 10 light infantry companies, men chosen for their fitness, energy, and enterprise, and often used as flank guards and skirmishers. The mission was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. Smith is described as an overweight, dull, and plodding officer nearing the end of his career. However, Gage chose Smith not just for his prudence, caution, and dignity, but because Colonel Smith would follow orders. Second in command was the ranking British major in Boston, Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines. To maintain secrecy, General Gage had only divulged the details of the mission to Smith and Pitcairn. The rest of the Redcoats assembled that night had no idea of where they were going or what they would do when they got there. While choosing a strike force in this way placed the cream of the British Army together, it had a major weakness. Officers and men of different regiments were not used to working with one another and found themselves commanded by strangers and compelled to fight alongside other units they did not know or trust. The Redcoats were loaded randomly on Navy longboats. After being rowed across Boston Harbor, the British troops landed at the sparsely populated north shore of Boston Harbor around midnight. They landed in a swamp called Leechmere Point in knee-deep cold water. They had been told to leave their packs behind and carry only one day's rations and 36 rounds of ammunition. In the confusing darkness of the swamp, the officers had difficulty sorting out the landing site and getting the troops organized by company for the march. Then they had to wait an additional hour for the Navy to bring previous provisions ashore for soldiers to carry. It was 2 a.m. before they got underway. Valuable time had been squandered. The near 1,000 regulars began marching west and reached the village of Monotamy around 3 a.m., where Lieutenant Colonel Smith decided to rest. Smith recognized speed was important and he was behind schedule, so he ordered an advance party of 6 companies of light infantry under command of Major Pitcairn to lead the column and secure the bridges at Concord they would have to use to reach their destination just west of town. The light infantry would be able to move swiftly ahead of the main column. Pitcairn left the main column with about 250 men. As they made their way along, they began to hear signal shots in the distance, first ahead, then behind, then on all sides. Signal bonfires began to be seen on distant hillsides. Church bells were heard ringing in the distance. The men marching in the dark were hand-picked, but mostly inexperienced. Some were conscripts. The troops were being led by officers they were unfamiliar with. They were wet and cold. Many had drained their canteens. They were deep into hostile territory in the dead of night, and they began to fear. To confirm Revere's warning, Captain Parker in Lexington had sent out scouts to gain intelligence because there had been false alarms in the past. One scout returned between 3 and 4 a.m. to report that Revere was mistaken. Parker dismissed his men but ordered them to remain nearby. Most of them decided to wait at Buckman's Tavern. Following the tradition of not carrying loaded firearms into a tavern, they fired their muskets into the air before entering. In the meantime, the commander of Gage's patrol, sent out the day before to intercept Patriot messengers, came riding up very excited. His scouts had captured none other than Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott. Dr. Prescott had managed to escape. When asked what Revere was about, Revere informed the patrol of the British Army's mission that night. It was news to the Redcoat Patrol. Upon hearing the firearms discharge at Buckman's Tavern less than a mile away, they asked Revere what was going on. He replied that Lexington knew about the threat, that they had assembled 500 men, and that if the patrol lingered in that position, they were dead men. The patrol freed Revere and Dawes after taking their horses and immediately rode toward Boston to notify the approaching Redcoat column. The story spread like wildfire through the column, further increasing the fear. By fate or happenstance, Major Pitcairn's advance party met two small groups of Patriot militia soon after and were told a similar story. Between 500 and 1,000 militia were waiting for the regulars in Lexington. Upon hearing this, Pitcairn had his soldiers load their muskets. This was proved to be a fateful decision. Major Pitcairn's force arrived in Lexington about 4:30 in the morning. Parker and his men were assembled on Lexington Green, where the road forks to the north and the west. He had positioned his men within musket shot of the road, but not on it. They waited in parade formation, not a fighting formation in ranks or in an ambush. At the head of the British column that reached the fork in the road was Lieutenant Jesse Adair. Adair was a hard-charging young Marine chosen for his energy by Major Pitcairn. It was Adair's job to keep the column moving rapidly. Major Pitcairn was further back, in the middle of the column with other officers. As Lieutenant Adair came within sight of the green, he had to choose left or right, left toward Concord or to the right toward Lexington Green and the assembled militia. Adair chose to the right, and the frightened and excited regulars followed, and their muskets already loaded. The Redcoats stopped about 60 yards away from Captain Parker's men and formed into battle formation, shouting the traditional British battle cry of "Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!" Parker's men began to move back. Captain Parker commanded his men, "The first man who offers to run will be shot down. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they want to have a war, let it begin here." Major Pitcairn and four other officers on horseback galloped onto the green toward the militia. A British officer was heard to yell, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels!" Others heard, "Ye villains, ye rebels, disperse, damn you, disperse!" Captain Parker noted the disparity between the size of the force and that of the regulars, and he didn't want a useless slaughter, so he ordered his men to disperse, not to lay down their weapons. A few did disperse. A few didn't hear him above all the noise and shouting. Yet others decided it was their town. They were entirely within the law, and they decided to stand their ground on principle. Principle. One does not hear that much these days spoken. At that moment, a shot rang out. We will never know who fired it. It is believed the colonists did not fire the shot, but the regulars were not given the order to fire. It is possible one of the mounted British officers fired his pistol or that it went off by accident. Next, several regulars opened fire. Then they reloaded with efficiency and began to send volleys into the militia. The regulars then broke ranks and lunged with bayonets at anything they could. Discipline had broken down. Major Pitcairn had lost complete control of his men. Jonas Parker declared that he would never run and was shot down. While struggling on the ground to reload his musket, he was run through with a bayonet. Ebenezer Monroe thought there was no chance for escape, so he might as well fire back. Only two militiamen fell dead on the line where they mustered, Jonas Parker and Robert Monroe. The rest were killed while following the order to disperse. Jonathan Harrington, the uncle of the fifer, fell with a gaping chest wound only a few yards from his home. His wife and 8-year-old son watched in horror as he struggled to get up, and then crawled to his doorstep where he died in his wife's arms. Isaac Muzzy, 17 years old, died at his father's feet. 7 militiamen were killed and 9 wounded. Only 1 British regular received a slight leg wound. At this point, Lieutenant Colonel Smith arrived with the main body of troops. He is horrified at the spectacle and orders a drummer to sound assembly to regain control of his troops. The regulars ceased their destruction and fell back into ranks. To restore morale and to make sure their muskets were unloaded, Colonel Smith had the troops fire a victory volley with 3 huzzahs. Can you imagine what the townspeople felt? Peaceful citizens who were only minding their own business had been slaughtered. They were killed on their own property by an army charged to protect them. Then the officer in command reveled in the victory and celebrated with brutality. It must have made the aftermath even more bitter to the survivors and the day's townsfolk. Colonel Smith conferred with his junior officers. For the first time, he tells them about the mission. His junior officers observed that a tragedy had occurred, their element of surprise had been lost, and a great deal of anger stirred up. They tell Smith the mission has been compromised and is no longer possible to achieve. The officers recommend they go back to Boston while they still can. But Colonel Smith was not chosen for his wisdom, but for his willingness to follow orders. He decided to continue on to Concord. After a brief rest, the Redcoat column reformed. With fife and drum playing this time, the regulars began the march to Concord 5 miles down the road. The people of Lexington were shocked and terribly angry. They began to take stock of their losses, treat the wounded, and to carry off the dead. Captain Parker reorganized what was left of the militia company. He and his men were filled with a terrible resolve because they knew one thing for certain. Wherever the regulars were going, they would use this same road to return to Boston. Parker's men would be waiting and prepared for the battle. The match had been struck for the first time, but was only a spark. However, a great deal of tinder and kindling had been gathered. Stay tuned for the second strike.